The couple wanted to know what the hard evidence was for these electromagnetic fields. Roll explained the only way to be certain would be to measure what was going on in the house, and that would take time. So it's only theory, the woman said. The couple wasn't about to have us in the house measuring EM fields for a week on theory alone. Too disruptive, they said. Roll is convinced there's nothing odd in this conversation. The woman seemed fine, lucid. She didn't sound haunted. But I wondered out loud, if everything's just peachy, then why are they selling the house? They wouldn't tell me, Bill replied.
Most people who are exposed to this type of occurrence in their home, since there's no ordinary explanation for these incidents, well, it must be supernatural, and the likely explanation is, again, ghosts or demons, and you don't like to talk about that to anybody, especially now that you may be thinking about selling the house. You know, who's going to buy a haunted house? Alternatively, people think that maybe they're just going crazy.
June 1998. A British newspaper report. Low-frequency sound waves, inaudible but otherwise felt by the human body, can sometimes masquerade as ghostly phenomena. The Daily Telegraph says feelings of cold and terror are capable of being triggered by nothing more than the wind passing over the walls. Low-frequency sound can concentrate into a physical effect called a standing wave, which causes things in its path to vibrate in sympathy. You'd swear it was a ghost. The discovery was made by Vic Tandy. He chanced upon his apparition 2 decades ago while working late one night in a medical equipment lab.
And I started to feel increasingly uncomfortable, you know, sort of hair standing up on the back of your neck, feeling as if you were being looked at, feeling cold. And then this sort of grey object appeared. Maybe this is something real, maybe it's a shadow. Had a whole list of things that I was going through. Maybe if I ignore it, it'll go away, you know. But it didn't. So in the end, I decided to turn around and look at it. And as I did that, it disappeared. So I started putting it down to strong coffee. So I packed up and went home. And the following day, I was going in for a fencing competition, you know, sword fighting. The type of handle that I like to use on my foil on the sword, I needed to cut a thread onto the blade. I had all the gear to do it, but it was very, very much easier if I could just hold it in the vise on the engineer's bench in the lab. So I went in early, put the foil blade into the vise, and things started to move. So I could just see a slight movement at the end of the foil. I suppose it didn't take too long for me to work out that it was actually just getting some energy from somewhere. It wasn't something spooky happening.
It was a standing wave, and it was trapped in the lab. Vic Tandy soon located the source of his ghost. It was a large machine, an extractor fan, that had recently been installed at the factory.
That was clearly the source. When we turned that off, the effect went away, and it was as if we'd thrown open the windows in the room. While it was on all the time, you just sort of adapted to it, but as soon as it was turned off, you thought, oh, thank goodness for that, you know. There was a very noticeable effect, but you didn't notice it if you were in it for a long time.
Scientists at NASA, the American space program, determined the resonant frequency of the human eyeball is at 18 hertz, that's 18 cycles per second. Vision smudges at that frequency. Outlines of apparitions sometimes appear. Vic Tandy roughly calculated the standing wave in his lab at around 18 hertz. The same measurement as NASA's, the telltale footprint of his ghost. There's a special relationship between sound and the way things look. Buddhism teaches that everything one perceives is illusory. One Lama taught me a lesson I'll never forget. I asked Zasep Tulku Rinpoche for a demonstration of Tibetan overtone chanting for Chance Encounter, a television program I made a couple of years back. He complied with the request, filling the room with an eerie, hoarse style of throat singing. I was familiar with low-pitched overtones, and by this time had learned to produce a reasonable facsimile of the sound myself. Here's what I did. Well, you get the picture. What I wasn't prepared for was the accompanying visual effects. As Zasep intoned, I watched his face distort, then transform, eyes bugging out, into what appeared to be one of the wrathful deities depicted in traditional Tibetan Thangka paintings. For a moment, Zasep had become a wrathful, dragon-like deity. That's how I perceived him. "Do you require any more?" he asked. Thanks. No, I said, a bit stunned by the experience.
Haunted House, Haunted Mind by Don Hill, an investigation along the trail of illusion and hallucination. You're listening to Ideas on CBC Radio 1.
Imagine Selwyn Dewdney's surprise in the fall of 1958 when he came upon a wall of dramatic, centuries-old rock paintings on a cliff, jutting out over a lonely northern shore along Lake Superior. The dramatic Vision Quest site at Agawam Bay, just south and west of Wawa, Ontario, had finally revealed itself after 14 months of intensive searching. In the early 80s, I myself experienced the wonder of the rock paintings at Agawam Bay. Fog had blown in off the water, enough to discourage tourists from straying off the Trans-Canada Highway and down a winding dirt road that led to the site. Years before, I had come to the sacred cliffs along the lake when my wife Anne and I were collecting oral history throughout northern Ontario. There were no markers guiding our way then. The location was a local curiosity and hardly ever broadcast to outsiders. I felt compelled to visit again, this time alone. The gloomy weather ensured my solitude at the site. The wind picked up as I trekked down to the water. A curious whistling sound echoed through a canyon-like gap that veered off to the right of the main trail. A huge, solitary boulder wedged at the top of the gap looked as if it was working to split the landscape in two. Perhaps it was responsible for the sound, I thought. I stopped to listen. Creeping along the cliff, camera in hand, I snapped the first in a series of photographs of the rock images. The forest animals and battle pictorials were clear enough, their meaning self-evident. But what were these odd thingies? My eye was attracted to the swirls and abstract forms that graced other sections of the wall. Funny, I thought. These squiggly lines looked strangely familiar. Had I seen them before? Prolonged rounds of drumming and chanting are said to induce trance hallucinations. The drone of the didgeridoo, a wind instrument sacred to the Australian Aborigine people, can create a sonic substrate for visions. The art of the Aborigines, many African cultures, and native North Americans is filled with visionary images, entoptic images, which means within vision, geometric patterns that turn up consistently in rock and cave paintings, petroglyph, and Vision Quest sites. The astonishing thing about entoptic imagery is it appears to jump between cultures, even when distance and chronology make it impossible for civilizations to have had any contact with one another. The images appear to be produced by the brain.
We have direct evidence of it from, say, the Amazon basin, where people do indeed make imagery and explain to their inquirers that this is the imagery they see in trance states. And neuropsychological studies conducted far away from the Amazon basin have produced just the same sort of geometric imagery.